they can follow the directions on seed packets, when to start seeds. That's a little bit more accurate for them. But for us in Florida, those directions don't apply. So that in itself is a nightmare if you're a new gardener, because you're reading those directions, you're planting it, how it says, but your garden is failing. So you feel like you're the problem. You just, you're not a good gardener. No, it's just nothing is catered. The general information out there is not catered to Florida climate specifically. So you have no choice but to go connect with other Florida gardeners, wherever that might be, and learn from them.
Hey there, wonderful listeners. I'm Amy, your host from the Garden Glow Up channel, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the very first episode of the Garden Glow Up podcast. Today, I'm joined by the incredible Jerra, and together we'll be diving into the world of vegetable gardening in Florida for December 2023 and spilling the beans on our exciting plans for January 2024. Whether you're in Florida or in a tropical or subtropical climate, this episode is tailor-made for you. Now, for our friends who are new to gardening, the growing season in tropical climates is entirely different to temperate climates. We kick things off in the fall and grow straight through the spring and wrap it up just as summer kicks in. So at this point, we're about halfway through the growing season. A warm welcome to Jerra, a gardening guru with roots in the Dominican Republic and a lifetime of green thumb expertise. You can find her active on various social platforms. Check out the show notes for the links and her website where you can snag some of the seeds she recommends. So Jerra, spill the beans. How did December treat your garden?
December was really great, actually. I have to say, compared to last year, because last year I got hit by 2 hurricanes back to back, like, a lot of other gardeners in Florida. So that caused, and one of those was in November. So all of the destruction and everything from all of that carried into December, and it killed all my fall tomato crops. It caused diseases and pests to go crazy because the extra moisture and everything contributes to that. So I had a really rough time last year. This year, I didn't get hit directly. Also, Florida has been kind of in we received a lot less rain than what we normally do, which is not good, but it also helps a lot with controlling the pests and diseases. So my garden right now looks really good. And the other unusual thing, I guess every year is a little bit different, Another unusual thing about this winter and December specifically is normally my first cold front moves into the area the very last week of December. And what I mean by cold is freezing temperatures where, I'm actually worried maybe my plants would get damaged or something. And that happens on the dot the last week of the last week of December for the last 5 years that I've really been tracking it. But this year it hasn't arrived. So I don't know what that means. A lot of people are predicting this winter was going to be one of the coldest. I believe it started a little earlier because I got my first, cold front in the 40s in November, which is odd. Usually that happens in December as well. But it's just showing how unusual, Florida winters can be. It fluctuates a lot. Every year's a little bit different. But because we have less rain, I didn't get hit by hurricanes, and the weather has been warmer. I haven't got damaging cold yet. The garden is really thriving. This is the best tomato season I've ever had. Everything's really lush. Even my squash plants that normally get eaten up by tons of worms and lots of powdery mildew and things are looking pretty good. Everything's nice and green. So I'm very happy. It's been really good for me. I don't know about other people, but it's been an interesting but very good December for me.
That's awesome. So for everybody out there, Jerra, you're in Central Florida, right?
I am Central Florida. I'm located in Orlando. I am now zone 10A. Used to be 9B, but with the updated USDA garden zone map, I'm now moved to 10A. So that's pretty much my climate. I'm considered a subtropical region of Florida.
Mm-hmm. And I'm in South Florida, so my zone just got bumped up to zone 11. Yeah, which in my mind used to be for the Keys, but now it's South Florida as well. The weather around here has been, we had a storm that came in about a week ago and just kind of stopped everything because it was this constant drizzle. which was fine for the garden. And like you mentioned, my garden is also looking very lush and just like things are really getting big and just ready to harvest. So things are looking awesome. I will say that for me, the hurricanes you mentioned didn't come by for us last year. So I can only imagine how much that just interrupted. And the reason I mention that is because right now, the biggest obstacle I've had in my garden is just that the holidays just passed and everything that was in the ground, not in the ground, but in my raised beds is doing wonderful. But everything that depended on me, like all my seedlings, have just taken a break and everything just like pauses like it feels like December was just this massive pause, like things that were doing well are doing well, things that you haven't started, like you can't make that up, it's just where it is. So
well, are your seedlings just like outside, not covered or anything like that?
No, so we got last year for the first time, we got frost and it almost killed one of my banana trees, but I would have probably not believed you if you would have been like, oh yeah, we get frost and we have to protect our plants. I would have been like, no, you're in Florida. What are you talking about? But last year, for the first time, it happened to me. So I do think that that's a big difference between like Central Florida and South Florida, is that it sounds like that's way more regular for you. And if I get like one day where that happens, it happens one time.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. You guys, it's like summer all year round for you guys, and to get a frost is probably really odd. I would say maybe, 40s, low 40s is even kind of odd for you guys. But seedlings and stuff, they need warmth or they just don't take off. They actually just stop growing and things like that. So I don't put my seedlings outside, just outside, unless it's very warm, a bright, nice sunny day, which we do get during the winter. But in general, I used to start my seeds indoors for that very reason, to control the temperature and make sure that they just really took off and grew. But this year, I have a nursery. I have way too many plants to be bringing indoors and starting seeds indoors, and I have 2 gardens too, so I'm starting seeds for both. That's hundreds of things. So I have shelving units. I have little mini greenhouses outside now so that I can start my seeds in there and keep them warm. And it's like nothing has happened. It's like there's no cold, nothing phases them. They look great. So that's, definitely seedlings are more so affected by colder weather than like a mature plant. My mature tomato plants that I started planted in September for my fall crop, they're huge plants by now. And so if some cold comes in, the low 40s, even down to like 32 and stuff like that, which is freezing now, they survive because we only get that little bit of, 32 or below for an hour to maybe in the middle of the night. It's not enough to kill the plant. It might cause a little bit of damage on a mature, plant, but not enough to kill it. But a seedling, it's enough to kill a seedling. So I don't put them outdoors like that. I make sure that they're nice, warm, and happy. Especially right now, I'm starting my whole spring garden, and so those are all warm season crops that are even more so affected by those cooler temperatures.
That's awesome. Okay, so I want to jump into what you have planned for spring, but before we do that, we've mentioned the zone a few times. So I want to just talk about it real quick for maybe people who are hearing about it for the first time. Would you like to explain what happened?
Yeah. Hold on one second. Let me get over to the section here about the zone hardiness changes. All right, so I actually did a whole YouTube video about this, the updated USDA garden zone map and what that means for you as a gardener. It's tough because all gardeners, when you're talking amongst each other, we refer to our gardens by the zone. So I'll say, I'm a 10A gardener, you're a zone 11 gardener. And that really doesn't give a good picture, honestly, of how similar the climates are. The only thing that zones accounts for tells you one thing, and that is how cold it could potentially get in any random winter any year in your area. That's it. It doesn't account for other, which I feel are more important things to consider about your own microclimate for your garden, like how much rain do you get, the kinds of pests and diseases that are in your area, the type of soil you have, how much sunlight, like all of these factors contribute to your garden together as one. So that garden zone data thing is just one little piece of that puzzle. And so to use that information in your garden, basically it's for when you're, shopping around at the nursery for new plants to add to your garden, or choosing the correct types of perennials, so perennial plants or fruit trees, that kind of thing, to make sure that they will survive your winter and therefore be perennial. So that's it. As using my garden as an example, I'm zone 10A. I could potentially see weather down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And actually, over the last couple years, I was labeled as zone 10 or 9B, actually, for the last few years. I was tracking my own data, and that is the lowest I've seen in my area, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So I actually agree with my change being bumped up to 10A, which is that bracket of the lowest possible being 30. Now, that is an average, though. So the calculations, the data, and everything that goes into calculating the temperature ranges and stuff for each zone is just an average. So there's some years that are warmer, there's some years that are colder. So randomly, I would say maybe like for us here in Florida, maybe 1 year out of 10 is actually colder than that. It might drop below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So just when I'm picking out fruit trees and stuff, I'll research that cultivar name and pick one that is even just a little bit more cold hardy than that 30 range. I would say maybe 28 or 25 degrees Fahrenheit, just to make sure that if we do get that 1 out of 10 years that's super cold for whatever reason, that my garden is okay. So that's it. That's all that garden zones help you with. And I feel like when they updated that map, it caused a stir, like all over the internet, all over gardening, social media. Everyone was like freaking out. Mostly the newbies, the new gardeners, because they don't understand yet. Like that is just one little thing about your garden, and it doesn't really affect anything else. You don't have to change anything really because of that, except for what perennials you're picking for your garden. So I made a whole YouTube video about that because I wanted people to kind of like calm down a little bit. Like, hey, this isn't a big deal. I mean, it only affects one little aspect of gardening, but we need to focus on these other things as well. So I also talked about, I have a garden journal. I take notes for all sorts of different observations in my garden so that I can master my microclimate, understand it. And so no matter what the zone I'm in, whatever changes, I'm okay. I understand it for myself.
Absolutely. One of the things I had noticed was when I first started, you find out that people in California are in similar zones. But then when you really start understanding your area, you're like, well, why can't I do what that gardener over there is doing? And then you realize, like, it's what you're saying. The zone, it helps you understand when you're new, like maybe what your limits are, researching a plant, but in reality, it's just like a small indication of like what your area can handle. And it's not like, oh, okay, if this packet says this is what you do in this zone, there's some flexibility to that, I would say. And you have to take that into account and maybe follow local gardeners, and they'll be able to point you in the right direction.
Exactly. You have to connect with your local gardeners wherever you can. Facebook groups have been a big help to me. I learned a lot from that. YouTube channels, whatever you got to do, because I lived in Texas for 3 years, same zone as what I was in Florida, and the climate was not the same. Okay, they got our winters there started earlier. We received more cold fronts, and it just lingered much longer than, the same zone that I lived in Florida. It was so much more colder that I would actually see icicles forming off from like street signs and stuff. I'm like, you never see that here in Florida. You never see icicles in Florida. So we were the same zone, and I'm gardening there as well, but it was very different. So again, it's not going to account for how frequent you're going to get a frost, how early your frost date is. first and last, your first frost of the winter season and your last frost of the spring season dates are going to be different, even if you're in the same zone. Someone in California that's the same zone as me, they don't get much rain. Like, it's a very dry climate. It's more of a Mediterranean type climate when we're like a rainforest. There's parts of Florida considered rainforest. We have a monsoon season. So California can't grow like some of these things, I call it jungle gardening, like that we do here in the summer, because they don't have that humidity, they don't have that rain. Certain plants need that. And then we can't grow some of the things they do because our climate is too wet, and it's like the reverse opposite. So zones don't account for any of that at all. It just tells you how cold the weather may get.
Right. I would say, for if anybody's out there and is a real newbie and is just kind of hearing these things for the first time, one of the things that did help me, for instance, is when I did look at the zones and realizing that, like, in my mind, if you're a Florida gardener, you're a Florida gardener. But now that you're listening to us talk, you might have realized we're in different zones and we're actually experiencing different environments. And that was one of the ways in which it helped me, was to just really wrap my head around the fact that, like, gardening in Central Florida is not the same as gardening in South Florida. And yeah, there might be some rules of thumb that carry through, but you really are going to see some big differences, which is, what the zones attempt to address. So I would say that if you're really new and you've never really heard about this before, just keep it in mind that these things aim to help, but they're not going to capture everything. So I think that's what the zones are for.
Right. I mean, it's a good starting point, of course, get a grasp for it, but then you really need to start learning the little nitty-gritty details about your garden. And then Florida on its own is its own animal. We're subtropical, tropical climates. There's only certain other parts of the United States that are kind of similar. So most of the southern states that border a coastline are considered subtropical, but they still don't get nearly as enough rain as we do. But they are considered subtropical. And then you move south through Florida, you move more southern, and it's now tropical rainforest. And there's only 2 other places in the United States that have that kind of a climate, Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Florida are like on our own. Everyone else is their own thing. They can follow the directions on seed packets, when to start seeds. That's a little bit more accurate for them. But for us in Florida, those directions don't apply. So that in itself is a nightmare if you're a new gardener, because you're reading those directions, you're planting it, how it says, but your garden is failing. So you feel like you're the problem. You just, you're not a good gardener. No, it's just nothing is catered. The general information out there is not catered to Florida climate specifically. So you have no choice but to go connect with other Florida gardeners, wherever that might be, and learn from them.
If we say nothing else today, that is like such a gem. Like, Florida and a few places in the US really stand out in terms of our climate, and it really is a totally different animal, which is why I think local gardeners like you are so important, because without somebody to show, like, for me, I just like having a garden to learn, but also like in the hopes of one day being able to feed my family, like, we're getting there, and I'm doing the seed starting series, and like certainly getting there and having little wins here and there. But if it wasn't for local gardeners, I would have never gotten this far, because there really are no resources. And that's what I enjoy gardening. I'll put it on TV and stuff, but I find a lot of the resources are for temperate gardeners. And if you're in Florida, that can really throw you for a loop.
For sure. Yeah. And then, like, if you're a northern gardener, a lot of people move here from the north. And you were a great gardener up there, right? You grew everything. But you moved down here, you're repeating your method, your process for when you were up north, and it totally doesn't work here. Like, all the time I see this, people trying to grow tomatoes in the summer. Ideally, everyone thinks, tomato is a summer crop. That's what you associate with. But in Florida, it's a fall, winter and very early spring crop. It's like the exact opposite. So then they get all frustrated as well that they don't understand, what's going on. I used to be a great gardener and moved down here. Now nothing grows. Well, again, you have to connect with Florida gardeners and learn from them.
I feel so bad every time I see somebody like in South Florida that moves and they're like, I just built a greenhouse. And I'm like, oh, you can't use a greenhouse.
Why?
You're gonna.
You need shade cloth. If you put an AC in it, maybe. Okay.
Okay. So with that, would you like to transition into January? And what are your plans for January and what we local gardeners should be thinking about?
All right. So January is all about spring gardening. And, again, those northerners think we're crazy when I say, yeah, I'm planting my tomatoes at the end of January. That's how it is here in Florida. I'm planting corn as well at the end of January. And you'll never see anywhere directions that say to do that. But, spring gardening started for me in November, actually. I start pulling all my seeds, deciding what I want to grow for the next upcoming season. And I make little baggies with months written on it. So I know, okay, January 1st, I got to sow seeds for all of this stuff. February 1st, this is the next round. And that kind of helps me, first off, not miss anything, miss a seed or something, and just stay organized and pace it out so you don't feel overwhelmed. So that's kind of how I strategize the whole thing. But I started in November because some crops take 3 months to get from seed to a nice transplant size, like eggplants and peppers. They just take forever. They're really slow to grow, get a nice size that I prefer anyways to then, put out in the garden. So I started those in November, but it's not too late. I started some more in December. I got some new seeds and stuff and I just, started those. But yeah, it really starts, months ahead of time in November for me because my last spring frost date is the second week of February. So I know you South Florida people, if you get a frost or last spring frost date is like January something, whatever that might be. So I have a couple more weeks of cold weather compared to you guys. But yeah, so November I already started peppers and eggplants. December is hitting the tomatoes. So all of my tomatoes have been started from seed right now, or because my plants are still alive back there, we didn't get a bad cold front or anything yet. I can take cuttings and just root those and not have to start all the way from seed. Excuse me. And then January is, other remaining things like cucumbers, squash, loofah, moringa, like all of these other cucurbits and stuff like that, melons, if I decide to start those early, like indoors or something. But I always try to direct those seeds as much as possible. It's less work, and the plants take off faster than if you started something earlier indoors and then planted it out. Like I've compared. So if I had a little transplant that I started months ago, it's ready to be transplanted, and then I pop in a seed, like a direct sowed seed at that moment, that direct seed, that direct sowed seed always takes off much faster than that transplanted. So, you got to gauge what's going to be better, either start something early indoors or just direct sow it from seed. So January is more of that kind of a focus. And then February is direct sowing seeds for warm weather. So like instead of this year, I'm not going to start my cucumber from seed indoors. I'm going to wait to just direct sow them. So that'll be the month of February, along with other melons and stuff like that. Now, knowing that I'm going to be transplanting some things starting in January, I know I get at least one, maybe two more, not severe like freezing temperatures, usually 40s, something like that. And, tomato seedlings, warm weather crops, they don't like that. So I am prepared. I have, I'll cut the bottom off from milk jugs, flip them over to make like a little mini greenhouse over that seedling, or flip some cardboard boxes over, whatever you got to do. This year I got some actual hoops. I'm going to, because I tend to plant all my tomatoes in rows. So I was like, let me make some hoops this time and set up some cloth and just do the whole row, and get it all done at once. If we get that kind of cold. But so don't do that unless you're prepared to protect your plants. Otherwise, just wait until your last spring frost date has passed. But by doing that, I get a head start on my season by at least like 3 weeks, sometimes or more. So, January is spring gardening, just pure, planning it, figuring out where I'm going to plant stuff. I draw maps even of my garden so I can kind of place things around, and taking care of all my seedlings, fertilizing them, getting them to be just as healthy as possible so that I can transplant them out into the garden.
I love what you said about direct sowing, because while I've been doing my seed starting series, the way I thought about it was I felt like I had more control if I did everything in seed starters. But especially with some of the bigger plants that you were mentioning, the squashes, the cucumbers, I realized that when I transplanted them out, they were just simply they didn't transplant well. And I was really surprised. I was like, why did this happen? And so exactly what you had said about direct sowing, I was like, well, maybe that's something I need to try a little bit more. In order to maybe get some of these plants that I do know are they're vigorous growing plants. They need a lot of space. But maybe that's something that I need to attempt a little bit more and just test them out, like one versus the other. That's the good thing about growing seeds, is that like they're so cheap, you can test,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I
And if
figured
you get quality seed, like, it's going to germinate. Some people put a lot of seed and thin out and throw stuff away because they feel like, oh, I'm not going to get good germination. But if you get seed from a quality source, they're going to germinate. So I literally put 1 or 2 tomato seeds in, I do them in solo cups. I know they both almost always germinate. So you're not wasting seed and time, thinning things out.
Absolutely. So I agree with you. I've had like, as I've been doing the seed starting series and testing everything out, everything germinates. And so it was encouraging in the sense of, okay, like you kind of have this down. And so now it becomes like a sense of finessing. Like, why didn't this plant do well when I did this? So it's exactly what you're saying. I think with some of the bigger, more vigorous plants, I'm going to attempt direct sowing them, because I thought I'd be like drowning in cucumbers and squashes. And that's not the case. When I transplanted them out, they really struggled, and I was really surprised. So I'll be testing that out. But also in terms of just planting out in the raised beds. Again, for some reason, I thought if I started everything in seed starters, it gives you more control. But then what I realized was I felt like I lost out on a lot of time, that if I would have direct sown in the beds, some of the things that I've direct sown have done much better than the things that I started in the seed starters. And that for me was very surprising. I thought if you like had some sense of control, things would naturally do better. Like, okay, I've babied this seed from start to finish, but apparently that's not always the case.
It just depends. Like, us being here in Florida, we have that luxury. We have such a long growing season that we can wait to direct sow seeds. So those bigger crops, the cucumbers, the squashes, things like that, when they sprout, they're big, they're noticeable. You're not going to forget about it, right? So go ahead and, direct sow those seeds out. Now, if you're a northern gardener with a short growing season, you kind of have no choice but to get started indoors to give them a little bit of a head start. But, I find that when they are in a container, they know. It's like they sense there's no room for them to go or take off. Almost like if you have a fish in a little fish tank and then all of a sudden you put it in a big one, it starts growing. It's kind of like it takes them a period of time to adjust and recognize, like, oh, I'm in the ground now. I can go crazy. And then they start, catching up and like putting out that new growth and really taking off and expand. But, if you're in a warm weather climate, you can skip a lot of that. And with the bigger stuff anyways, pop that seed in the ground and it's going to take off super quick and just be more healthy and vigorous and already adjusted to your climate. You're not going to have to go through the whole transplant shock and bringing them outdoors for a couple hours so they get full sun and then bringing them back in. And that whole thing is really annoying. But yeah, that works for us here in Florida. But if you're in the north, not so much. You probably still have to start seeds indoors for a lot of things.
Absolutely. So can you tell us what plants you're thinking about when it comes to January? Like, which do you think are the ones we really shouldn't be missing out on? Like, now's the prime time to get started with these.
Well, it's going to depend on what you like to eat. I always say, pick what, the fruits and veggies and stuff that you personally like to eat. Like, why are you going to dedicate garden space and put on all that work for something that you honestly just don't enjoy? It starts with that. Like, just start thinking about, what do you like to eat? What do you want to eat? It's consider a spring crop and summer crop, because that's another thing too. I like to plant out all of my summer. When I say summer, I mean like what the traditional American culture deems a summer crop, like tomatoes, cucumbers, stuff like that. I like to start all of that stuff and plant it in with my spring crops at the same time, summer and spring, because our summer is so hot and intense and rainy and diseases and everything that it kills all of those traditional summer crops. Yeah. So I find I'm much more successful doing watermelons and stuff. And I know Florida, we grow lots of melons, the farmers, even in the middle of summer, but those are farmers. They have equipment, they have expertise. I don't know how they do it. I struggle. I struggle with melons. There's a couple that work out really great for me, like the Kajari melons. I love that one. But so I start thinking about spring and summer crops. What do I want to grow this season? And I plant them all, or at least start them from seed at the same time in January. By the time April and May come around, my mindset is now shifting to jungle crops. That's what I call it. Jungle crops, super tropical, heat tolerant stuff, which tends to be lesser known things. Maybe you being in South Florida, you're obviously going to be a lot more familiar with those things than people here. I'm really familiar with them because my family's from the Dominican Republic. So like yucca, pigeon peas, we don't eat loofah, but that's something that a lot of Asian, cultures, they eat loofah, bitter melon, yard long beans. So like all of these super heat tolerant, they thrive in tropical climates. That's what I'm planting in April and May. And that's what's going to carry me through my summer, not these traditional things, not the tomatoes and cucumbers. I mean, I do grow some of the Asian varieties of cucumbers, like China Jade is like my favorite. And they do very well.
As you speak, you mentioned the Kajari melons, now you mentioned the China Jade cucumbers. I'm taking notes.
Yeah, China Jade is. I have quite a few different cucumber varieties on my website, and they're all great. But China Jade is just my favorite, and it's probably one of the number one seeds, and I sell out of it all the time. And I have to keep like planting whole crops of it and replenish my seeds. But it's just fantastic. So I definitely recommend that for Florida. You're still gonna get the diseases, even when something is said to be high, disease and pest resistant. You're still gonna get them. It just takes maybe longer for them to finally start coming through and actually affecting the plant. And that plant or that variety can kind of handle more of it before it actually really starts affecting it. So you still got to stay on top of spraying and managing, the health of your plants and stuff. But definitely, choosing the correct varieties of things is going to help you a lot, or at least reduce the work of keeping that plant alive. Absolutely. And helping you be successful at the end of the day with your harvest. January is just finishing up sowing any seeds that I want to do indoors, that whole thing, planting out my tomatoes, corn, beans. Well, I don't plant the corn and beans out. I start those in 72 cell seed trays because the soil is still kind of too cold for me here in Central Florida. Okay. So I find you can sow those, from seed indoors. And then I start planting those out like the first week of February or something like that. Lots of work. January is probably one of the most intensive months. I would say December and January for sowing spring and summer. I'm sowing 2 seasons at the same time. That's a lot. And another time of the year that gets real busy with seed sowing is July and August for all the fall stuff. So that's kind of the cycle that I go through every year.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things you mentioned, and it reminded me of something in my garden, is that for me, my eggplant, you can always see they're getting attacked, but they will always bear fruit. And you're like, it's just like, I don't know what pests are so attracted to them, but they'll always grow, they'll always bear fruit. And it's just kind of like, they're not pretty. Like when you look at it, you're like, this is not a pretty, and it would be if it wasn't getting attacked by stuff, but it gets constantly attacked. It doesn't really seem to affect anything else. but it bears fruit. So you're kind of just like, well, why not? And I let it do its thing.
Last year, I grew a lot of different eggplants. I really went crazy and experimented with them. And you're absolutely right. There's some pests that just go crazy over eggplant more than even my tomatoes and stuff. And spring and summer, I was dealing with so many squash bugs or stink bugs because they were attracted to the eggplants, I guess. They were all over them. They were laying eggs all over them. I had to like really keep up with it more so than any other year. I have not grown as much eggplant the previous years as I did this year. So I do blame it all on the eggplants. But those plants are tough. They survived. They survived through my summer. They continued producing for me through my summer, which is great, finding something that will still produce in the heat like that. And they're still alive right now. And I have eggplants that survive 2, sometimes even 3 years for me. So they last much longer than peppers and tomatoes in comparison. Yeah. So, and because of that, I've grown to appreciate them and love them. And I try, to learn new recipes with them because I'll tell you, they were not my favorite before. But, any kind of vegetable and stuff that I've thought I did not like, it completely changed my mind when I started growing it myself. The flavor, the texture, everything is far superior to anything you can find at the grocery store. And I have not grown something to date that I've tasted it and thought, I don't like this. It's a world of a difference. So eggplants was one of those things for me. I've grown to really appreciate it over years. I grow all sorts of different varieties. It's one of those few things that will still produce in the middle of summer in Florida. So it's a winner.
Absolutely. You mentioned something earlier that I wanted to pick your brain on. You mentioned that you're growing peppers. So down here, I can grow hot peppers, but not sweet peppers.
Really? Is that a South Florida thing? You all don't grow sweet peppers?
I think it is.
Do they stop producing for you? Is that what it is?
No, so I started some and they got so much scale that it just, I had to and I'm talking about I had just oh wow, these seedlings are doing so nicely. I transplanted them out and then they did not do well at all. But I have heard from everybody in South Florida, if you can get one sweet pepper to grow, consider yourself lucky. Maybe you kind of hit the jackpot once in your life and that's it. But we have much better luck with, not luck, our environment is much better for hot peppers. Are you in Central Florida? Do sweet peppers happen for you?
Oh yeah, I can grow sweet peppers and I grow hot peppers as well. And I do notice that the hot peppers are far more vigorous. They handle the heat better. They still produce in the middle of the heat. And those plants survive. And I feel like not too many pests and stuff bother them. I almost want to say, I don't know what's the chemical name of whatever it is that makes pepper spicy. But I thought I did some research about it and read something that chemical's in all parts of that plant. So nothing wants to eat it. I have not even found nematodes on the roots of hot peppers. Wow. So yeah, they're going to grow really great in our hot and crazy weather and not be too affected by too many pests and diseases. I still grow sweet peppers, but I find that they grow much better in spring or in fall. And I do, plant out a whole bunch of them right as soon as my last spring frost date has passed. That's February. I start harvesting like crazy, like April, May. And then when that heat starts coming, they really have a hard time with that. They stop producing for one. They're not going to produce. And I tend to get like white fly and stuff like that. But most of those pests are present because it's just very humid and wet, and they love, I guess, wet leaves, peppers, and stuff like that. So I just have to monitor and stay on top of it. But if I can get that pepper plant to survive and hit fall time when the temperatures drop, it's more temperate, they pick right back up and producing again. But normally they're not perennial for me. Like, a lot of people will pull out their pepper plants and bring them in for the winter and perennialize them or whatever. But I just find like with age, they really decline in production and stuff like that. And they just get sickly, whatever. So I would rather start from scratch with new pepper plants than, saving them. But, if you're up north and you have a very short warm season,
Right.
saving your pepper plants is very strategic because you need that plant to be as big as possible and it, immediately start growing for you. So that, differences there between the different climates. Here, I have plenty of time. I'm just going to restart mine and have nice, healthy, vigorous plants again.
Agreed. That's so interesting to know that you can do it. I'm very jealous. I love sweet peppers, and also, like, you had mentioned grow what you want to eat, which was when I started gardening, which that was all I wanted. I was like, if I could grow, because I also, like, my mother's Cuban. So I was like, if I could grow peppers, onions, and garlic, that's a sofrito, and like that goes into everything we eat. And it would just be such a responsible way in my mind of gardening. Like, you're gonna provide your family with quality food. You don't have to do everything. You just focus on the things that you're gonna eat. But that's a lot harder to do than you would think.
Yeah, but in Cuba, they grow sweet peppers. You might want to investigate what cultivars and things they grow there. And that's definitely hotter than us here. But do you guys use ají cachuca, if I'm saying that correctly, a lot in your cooking?
So I heard about that for the first time within the past year, because
okay.
I know the food can be a little bit different between the DR and Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Cubans are like, this is a rule of thumb, do not eat spicy food. So literally I've grown up in a kitchen with Cuban women, and I heard about cachuca for the first time within the past year. So I actually do have some of it growing out in my garden. But literally heard about it for the first time in the past year. But I agree with you about the cultivars. I didn't realize that. I will look into it and see if I can find the same cultivars, and maybe I'll have some luck with that.
I look at the Caribbean. I mean, obviously my family's from the Dominican Republic, so I look to our country for inspiration on what to grow here. Asia, Africa, South America, those things will grow really well in Florida. Yes. It might not be traditional, like, we're, Latin American, descent or Caribbean. So we're already kind of used to eating those things. Whereas like typical standard American culture and cuisine aren't that familiar with them. So part of what I try to do is teach about it, teach about these other alternative crops, because I feel like the rest of the world eats them. It's just not Americans that eat them. Especially yuca. I love yuca. I mean, I'm Dominican, and pigeon peas, guandules, all that stuff. Yeah. And they grow fantastic in Florida. But so part of my goal this year is to put more content out there about these crops and things that me and my family, we grow together on my second garden on my aunt's property. She has a couple acres in St. Cloud, still Central Florida. But we get together there and we have our garden. We grow those bigger, typical, Dominican crops there, along with chickens and bees. We do all of that over there. I'm the one that experiments more with like the traditional, like broccoli and tomatoes and stuff like that, because that's what I like to eat. So I have it all. I have a little bit from all, both cultures or whatever. But definitely taking inspiration from other countries and trying out things. People are, kind of intimidated sometimes, like bitter melon or eating loofah or something, because you don't know anything about it. But I encourage you, go to your Asian grocery stores or Latin American grocery stores and check out, try different fruits and vegetables, bring them back home, some recipes, or go eat at, local restaurants and try it. I guarantee you're going to like it, like it and be inspired to try growing it in your own garden.
That's a great point. I know that a lot of the things that do well in South Florida gardens are typically Asian cultivars. Mm-hmm. So that's true of the cucumbers, things like Thai basil. If you enjoy basil, we cannot grow Italian basil in South Florida. That's not going to happen. I mean, maybe you can force it, but that's very unlikely. But if you are okay with Thai basil, which gives more or less, it's the same flavor, it's just a smaller leaf, you're going to really enjoy it. And it's bred to grow in our climate. So if you make those intelligent like choices, you can really grow a lot of things that you wanted. Okay, so I did want to point out one last thing, which was you mentioned grow what you want to eat, UF has a great planting guide that divides Florida into North, Central, and South Florida and gives you a good idea as to what you can plant when. I can leave a link in the description box below, but they break it down month by month. So if anybody is out there thinking about, well, what can I grow and when, I'll leave that in the description box, because I think that was a great idea. That was a great gem by Hera. And truly, there are resources out there that can point you in the right direction so that you can kind of skip the phase of like, well, I tried it in June and it didn't work, you know? So that's available.
Yeah, I've seen those, the calendars that they put out, the monthly calendars,
Yeah.
and they are accurate. I definitely dug into that, when I was trying to figure out what to plant, when to grow these things or get them started. But it doesn't really explain like seed starting, because some things take 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, all of that. Right. You got to backtrack, learn how to calculate those things. But at least it tells you like, okay, you can plant this month. Now backtrack. Now you have to do the work of backtracking to figure out, all right, I need to start seeds in December or whatever that might be. Right. But that thing is so accurate, though. It is a great starting point for, everyone in the state of Florida specifically.
Absolutely. Okay, Hera. So do you have any last comments?
No.
Okay. So that's a wrap for today's Garden Glow Up podcast. A massive thank you to our incredible guest, Hera, for sharing her wealth of gardening wisdom. But before you go, we want to hear from you. Please share your gardening experiences and questions related to December and January garden. We'd love to connect with you and see how your gardens are thriving in different areas. Drop us a comment or send us your questions, and don't forget to mention your location. And for more of Hera's magic, check out the show notes for links to her social platforms and website where you can snag some fantastic seeds. Hera has a fantastic spring themed collaboration project brewing featuring gardeners from all corners of the country. It's dropping on her YouTube channel this January, so don't forget to hit the subscribe button and catch the video. And also mark your calendars, because Hera has some live classes coming your way. First up on Sunday, January 21st at 4 p.m. Eastern, it's all about planting and growing heirloom tomatoes. Then on Sunday, February 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern, she'll be sharing the secrets of getting started with backyard chickens, which I think is super cool, by the way. And a heads up, Hera's running a spring garden sale on all seeds and plants on her website until January 15th. So you better hustle over and get there before you miss out on the sale. A massive thank you to everyone tuning in to our inaugural podcast. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and drop us a comment below. Your support means the world to us.